Welcome, everybody, to our first ever, the inaugural APP Pro Mastermind session. My hope with these is that we will start doing these once every 2 weeks or perhaps once every week. Our primary goal being to identify workflows that are challenges that you're facing with workflows, and that we can come in here and we can work together to fix those, whether that be in the tools or work around the concepts of them, figuring out whether that be the implementation of them and the concept, but make those workflows better. Another goal of these masterminds is to have a space for discussion around the concepts that are part of action-powered productivity and productivity in general. Now, for this first session, I have a cold that has manifested as some laryngitis. So if occasionally I squeak, you'll have to forgive me, but that is the nature of the thing right now. I'm doing my best. I have my coffee. It's also my son's birthday, so I ran out and got some McDonald's breakfast as we knew he would enjoy. So I grabbed a coffee while I was there. So hopefully the warmth will be nice. Okay, so I think one of the things I'd like to talk about as we move through this session, and I think it applies well to before I turned the recording on. In fact, I eventually had to say, I have to stop and turn the recording on because we just started talking about topics and we were heading down a path that I knew needed to be on the recording. But I want to talk in particular about that space that exists between the concepts and the implementation. I've been writing my book, The Rhythms of Productivity, over the last 3 months or so. We're getting pretty close to that being done and ready to at least release it in an ebook form here in a few weeks. And after that, I'm intending to release it as a paperback as well. The point being, though, in writing that book, I am defining that line of what are the concepts that are part of action-powered productivity, because I don't want to dive too deeply into any specific implementation, because then we start talking about, okay, well, what tools specifically are we using? And I want to talk about tools, but not necessarily in the context of the concepts, because when we start talking about tools, then we're talking about specific implementation of the principles that are at the heart of action-powered productivity. The always start in the middle idea and the productivity bridges and the take action and capture recurrence. But this is an opportunity. What I see these masterminds as an opportunity to do is to say, okay, knowing these concepts, what are some ways, what are some tools, what are some methods by which we can implement those concepts and implement those principles in a practical way that will bring us improvements overall in our productivity. I think that the piece that's missing in a lot of, and this is in no way meant disparagingly toward other approaches, but I look at it, I think about Para as an example here. Para is great. There's nothing wrong with that. There's an organizational approach, but it doesn't get you super close to the action. It's just sort of, how do I get these things organized? There's nothing wrong with organization, but it doesn't get you right against the action. And the analogy I like to use is, I've taught voice, you wouldn't know it from listening to me today, but I've taught singers a lot over the last 20 years. And I've learned over time that when I do exercises as parts of their, not just warming up, but working on the technical elements of their voice, the closer I can design those exercises to the practical singing they'll be doing, the better. Meaning, it's fine to do exercises on just E vowels or ah vowels or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. But that doesn't always translate directly into the song that they're doing, because there's a lot of other consonants and a lot of other vowels and a lot of other variables. So the more that you can kind of bridge that with, okay, maybe I'm going to, now I've roped myself into singing briefly. Sorry for those of you who are listening to my voice today, but I could do an E, and then they could go do a thing over here. But it would be helpful if I would also have a situation where, hey, I know that you're going to be singing this text in this song. Let's do a little exercise built around that specific text where we can zero in on the aspects of it that are giving you trouble. The closer we can bring that exercise to action, to where the rubber meets the road, the more likely it is to be effective when they actually have to perform. That's what I'm trying to do with APP in general. And that's what I want these mastermind sessions to be about, is how do we get from that place of, oh, I've got these principles. Great. That's theoretical. How do I make them practical? How do I implement them in my tools so that I can genuinely be more productive? And so that's sort of the general space that we're in. So now, what we were talking about before I turned the recording on, and I'll let Lori explain it a little bit here, but the general idea was, what do we do with those ideas or the types of notes perhaps that come up and they sort of sit in the cracks of the things that we know how to capture and know how to surface. It's a little something we don't necessarily know how we want to see it again. How do we get that information captured? And so, Lori, let me turn it over to you, and you can share the specifics, because I think there are a lot of potential answers, and I think that we can have some really good conversation around.
Okay, so this one that happened yesterday. It's a small thing, but it's indicative, I think, of something I run into a lot. And I try to make beef jerky for our camping trips, and with limited success. And I ran into a tip yesterday that Costco sells these thinly sliced pieces of beef, kind of like steakums, and that this is a good source material to make beef jerky from. I thought, oh, that's it. Next time I'm looking to make beef jerky, I need to remember, go to Costco and buy this thinly sliced beef. So where do I put that? I mean, I have a tag that I created for packing for a backpacking trip. I have tags for recipes, but I don't know that fits there necessarily.
Right.
And so that's the kind of thing that I run into, is where does this go so that I can find it again?
And I think that the critical question, so when in the note-taking chapter in the upcoming The Rhythms of Productivity, I talk about the idea of capturing and surfacing in these terms, that we need to, whenever we capture a note, we need to capture it with whatever information, whatever metadata is required, that we can surface it in the appropriate context, because it's a pair. If we don't think about when and how and in what context we want to see something, then we're never going to know quite how to capture it. And I think, and I'd be interested in input from others on this, I think the critical question is that we don't have a clear definition for when you are going to make beef jerky next. And so the context of surfacing is whenever you make beef jerky next. And so we have to find, if we can pin down in whatever way the need to surface whenever you're going to make beef jerky next. And incidentally, what I love about these calls is I never really thought I would say beef jerky that many times in that close proximity on a productivity call, but here we are. Whenever you're going to make that next, that's when you need to see this note. Because if you can answer that, then we can figure out how we need to structure a note like that. And now obviously that's sort of hyper specific. We don't necessarily need to build a note that is the beef jerky structure note. But the concept of the whenever I'm going to see this, or whenever I'm going to do this next, that's a concept that comes up quite a bit in our note taking. I just need to see this whenever this is going to happen. What that implies to me, and this is the part that I'll be interested to hear whether there may be some other thoughts about specific implementation, is that we need to have some sort of structure built around what it means for you to create beef jerky, whether that be a task or a project or some entity that allows you to say, hey, that's the entity with which I would need to associate what I've captured here. I'm going to be quiet for a minute because I have some thoughts about how it might be, but I see if others, if that rings any bells for others in terms of that, or if there are other things you'd like to add to that.
In that particular case, RJ, I'd be inclined to add it to a recurring project in preparation for camping. So that now it would be different if it were saying, here's a potato salad recipe that I'm thinking about making, but I don't know when. And if you have a number of those, I might have a monthly recurring action that says, check the list of things that you may want to cook in the next month and add it to that list. But I agree with you that the key thing is to convert it into a task or something that is going to surface. And the best way to do that is to find something that looks like a task to which you can assign it.
I tend to agree. And what's interesting is that I had something not that dissimilar from this that I was doing this past Christmas. And that is I hear so much about chestnuts roasting on an open fire as a Christmas tradition, but never had that. And so I decided, hey, I want to roast some chestnuts in the oven
Oh,
this Christmas and I want to
did you try
experiment with that.
that?
I did.
Not as easy as it sounds.
No, it's harder. But it's a great example though, because I did it I got some chestnuts. I, followed some instructions. I had, I always endorse having a conversation with Chat GPT that can kind of help me shape the first rounds of things, kind of gather the information. I did it the first time and they were okay, but they clearly weren't done quite right. And I didn't do an open fire. I just did it in the oven. And so what I did then is this, and this is the part I think is similar, is I created the task for, make chestnuts again, roast chestnuts again. And with that, I included what I wanted to try next time I was going to do it. So that when I got to the task, I had the information of what I was going to do with it. And then, I think we did it right around Christmas or maybe even a couple days after Christmas. I did it that way. It went great. It turned out really well the second time. And so after that, I popped open Tana Capture and just said the recipe of what I did. And brought that into Tana and had it, with a quick conversation with AI within Tana, was able to turn it into not just me jabbering, but a list of 8 steps that are based on what I did when I know I did it right. And so now that's become my recipe. And I have a recurring action for September set up. This is, if you want to know just how in depth do I get with this stuff, a recurring action in September that says, remember to go look and see about getting fresh chestnuts, because September, October is when they're harvested, I have learned. And so I could, go about doing that again. But it was—
So you had a task that was roasted chestnuts?
I had a task for roast chestnuts. Yes. That was what it was. And in that task, it had included what I had tried before and what I wanted to do differently the next time. So I'm not like in the actual phrasing of the task, but indented underneath and then in the notes for that task.
I think that I heard you say that you had more than one task. You had a task for September, and then
I have a recurring task for September. Yes, and then so I actually have. If we want to go way into it, I actually also have a task that I want to set up a recurring holidays project that will involve all the things that I want to do around the holidays, and in that will be a roast chestnuts as well. But in terms of just the first, that's sort of the back end. That's the iteration 4 or 5 of the process. In terms of the first step, which is kind of where you are. Well, not the very first step, but you know what I mean. The question of how do I capture the jerky information? I did it with chestnuts by just creating a task to roast the chestnuts and then included the information with that. So, I mean,
I have
the simplest way would be that.
I have a backpacking. Well, it's in Notion, and I'm slowly bringing it over into Tana. And it is a food prep, gear packing, what to buy, different things.
Right.
And it's possible that I could put the make the jerky in that.
I think it fits there at the end, like as the final step. I think if you're still trying to figure out if you want to make the jerky a certain way, I don't think it goes there yet, because then you won't be trying out your next method until you're going to go backpacking. So, and then, which is fine if that's what you want to do. But I'm saying if you're wanting to iterate on the if you wanted to iterate on the jerky, which, I mean, the world has become strange, hasn't it? If you want to iterate on this beef jerky, you want to have, I think, a separate task, or even a project around make great beef jerky, that would have a few tasks that would get you there. And then once it's done, absolutely the place you want it to live beyond that is in your preparation for going there, because that's where it's most logical. That's where it's going to be done most often.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I guess the thing that the concept that I'm struggling with then is such a single use tag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little?
Explain to me. I wouldn't be using a beef jerky tag, to be clear.
So why did you do the chestnuts?
It was just a task. It was just called roast. Right. Yes, the tag was task.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I was using, and this is, and I see your hand, Penny. I'll come to you in 1 second here. This is a concept that I think is really valuable to think about, and that is when you look at the toolkit you have, sometimes the best answer is just it's something that's already in your toolkit that you can make work for this. And so the reason I use task for roast chestnut is that roast chestnuts is, well, that's the easiest way, and within my current toolkit, the easiest way to make sure that I see this and do it is just capture it as a task. You could for sure build another structure that was just like things I don't want to forget. And you could every, 5 days or whatever, review the list of things you don't want to forget. And one of the things on there could be beef jerky, like how you want to do beef jerky. That would also work. But then that would require you to build an additional structure to do that by just repurposing. It's not really repurposing. Roast chestnuts is a task. Make beef jerky is a task. There's just using that existing piece of the toolkit makes it so you don't have to reinvent anything as that. Go ahead, Penny.
So I two parts of this. So there is the beef jerky element, and then there's that one-off weird thing that you want to sort of come back at some point. So dealing with the beef jerky part, do you want to find out before your next camping trip whether or not that process works? And if so, do you go to Costco on a regular basis? In which case you might make it a task or something that, connects to your next shopping trip at Costco to try it out, right? I mean, once you make beef jerky, does it not last for a while?
It depends on how good it is.
Okay. Okay. So I'm just saying, it's like, maybe it doesn't, like RJ said, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the next camping trip. Maybe it's a matter of figuring out whether this is a system you want to use. And then after that, then you could put it into your food prep camping when you bring it over. The other thing you could do is, for the moment, stick it as a note in your Notion doc around camping, so at least you've got it somewhere. But the other issue is, what about those weird things that come up? Like, do you create a super tag that's, reminder and set it up to show up every once in a while or something like that? I have not sorted out. I haven't figured that out. I have a gajillion super tags that I still have to try to figure out what they all are and what's stored in them, because there's like a lot of stuff. So I guess it's a question of, figuring out where those things fit into your life and what is that mechanism. I don't think I've said anything that's terribly new or different.
No, but it's important to cover the bases there. And I think that the key point that you're going at there, Penny, and what Brian and I were talking about too, is is decide when you want to see it and in what context you want to see it, because that will determine how you need to capture it. I think by and large for myself, and I know your hand's up there too, Kelly, I'll be with you in 1 second. But I think by and large for myself, if there's any way at all I can think of it in terms of an action, that means I can put it as a task, and I'm much more likely to, that's a thing I do. And since it's a thing I do, then it's going to be arriving to me in a way that's well prepped for me to do it. And so that would be my encouragement there. Go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, so I'm kind of building off of what Penny was saying. For this particular example, it sounds, Lori, like this is something you definitely want to do. So the task approach that RJ and Brian were talking about makes the most. Why is it? Okay, sorry. Zoom's yelling at me to lower my hand. So I did. So that sounds like that's the right approach. But as Penny was saying, there are some other things that are just obscure bits of information that you don't really have any plan for right now. So for me, an example that just came top of mind is a lot of times I run across a review for a product or something that I will want to buy at some point in the future, say a new electric griddle. We have one now, but I have a little note saved of the next one we'll buy when ours breaks, just because it seems to be reviewed quite well. It's a bit bigger, a whole bunch of different reasons. Like I've come across a number of reviews for it that is the one we'll buy if and when ours breaks at some point. I'm not going to make a task for that because there's no definite date for it. There's even no guarantee that I will buy it. All I want to know is that if it does come to the point that I want to buy a new griddle, I have that written down somewhere. And so for me, that I threw that information in notes. Like you said, in Notion, you have a backpacking thing. I don't know the proper Notion terminology, group, page, database. And so for me, like I do have a food bin using the APP parlance, where I just create, tasks, say for shopping things if I need to remember to buy something, if it's associated food, or recipes go in there as well. Or it's something like this, I just create a little context note, a little bin note that I just tag as food, and just a little reminder to myself that, hey, these Costco, whatever they were, are recommended for beef jerky. That way, if in the future I remembered, oh yeah, I want to make beef jerky, I know where to go, and I just search that bin for that note. And so that would be my approach for something like this. But in your case, it does sound like something you definitely want to do, and so a task does make sense.
Go ahead, Lori.
Well, that kind of brings up a good question. So about the grill. So if I were wanting to take note of a grill that we might want to buy in the future, I wouldn't need to tag it anywhere. I would just say, here's a good review of a grill. And then at some point in the future, I might want to search grill, and it pops back up.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really, there's the search and the tag aspect, because presumably I could just search for grill and surface it that way.
That I think that works well, excuse me, for things like grill, where you're not likely to have used the word grill anywhere else. I think the only danger for that, for just relying on search, is that the verbiage has to become particularly specific. You have to make sure that you know the way you would have said it when you put it in, so that you can easily get it out. I talk about notes sort of in a hierarchy of actionableness, and that gets close to the level of what you might call a record. Some things that they're inert, they're not really actionable, but you want to be able to find them when you need to find them. And some of those things like that, you may not need to in any way add metadata. You may just go searching for them. I think the only danger is if there's likely to be some ambiguity when you go to search. If for whatever reason you've put grill in there many times, then you will kind of have wished you had that structure of a note built around that you could anchor on. But you're right, for things of that variety, grill, being able to use the search is certainly a viable option. Go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say there's a category of this kind of stuff that I put into a bin with tasks called follow-up. Then there's so that, for example, I ordered something this morning before this course or this Zoom call, and I got an email back acknowledging the fact that I'd ordered it. And I immediately created a task to follow up on that in 2 weeks to see whether or not it actually arrives. So that to me is one level of dealing with this kind of information. The other thing I'd point out is I like what Kelly did as far as saving that information. And a lot of people have a special category that they call ideas or future blog posts or almost anything like that occurs to them. But for any one of those things, I think you need a recurring action so that you are reminded at some periodicity, whatever's appropriate, to go take a look at the list so that you remember what's in the list. Otherwise, it's really easy to forget that you've got this really neat idea about an electric grill and you go out and buy a different one.
It's particularly, I think, easy to forget because there's something about building this toolkit and using it. And once you learn to trust it, you suddenly realize you're not bothering to remember things all that much anymore, because they're going to be safely stored in your system, which I consider, by the way, a feature rather than a bug. I don't want to be carrying a bunch of stuff around in my head. But then sometimes you'll put stuff in, if you don't put them in the way you normally would, or you just do them that way, and you don't have a way to resurface them, you'll also forget those things because you've become to trust that layer. So I think this is actually, I know, Lori, you're in APP&T right now, and our week coming up, we're going to be talking about that review structure. I think the big piece that most of us don't have as well implemented as we probably should in our toolkits is this idea of how and when do we review the things that are part of our toolkit. And that some of those things can be system level. Like I need to review my procedures and my templates to make sure they're still up to date and functional, or I need to review the projects to make sure I'm not, losing the thread of any of those projects. But others may be more sort of on the level of just what are the ideas that I have rather than system components. What are the ideas? And so, what we need to figure out is if you need a level like that, and I think it can be helpful for some people, how do we keep it from becoming a maintenance problem? Because the problems with reviews are that lots of times the reason we don't do them is we feel like they take too long. There's too many things. We're not going to be looking at them. So we need to make sure that we build to use my parlance, the bridges to make that as smooth as possible. One of those is what Brian just mentioned, the recurring task. We don't have a recurring task that's pointing us to the review. We aren't going to do it. Or we made it a lot more less likely that we're going to do it. Another is we need to think about how do we want that information to appear. So whether we're building some kind of dashboard, some set of queries that grouped into a dashboard, or whether we have a page just set up with the hierarchy that's particularly related to whatever we're reviewing, whatever that is, we need that recurring task to point us to that place. And ideally, particularly if we're going to use a system like, hey, I had an idea and I just want to review it every so often, we probably want to build in some kind of structure that lets us just review a few at a time, so that we might go to the same place, but if there's 150 things there, we're not going to review the 150 things every time we go there. So we might want to have it so that we can, knock out 10 or 15. And then, the next time we go there, those will be at the bottom of the list, and the other 135 will be up at the top, and we can just do a few at a time. So I think those are several different concepts, but they can all come into the same space. We can make it so that we remember to go there with a recurring task. We can make it so we know exactly where to go, and we've optimized that place for that review. And then we can make it so that we don't have to review every single thing every time we go. We can build a structure that allows you to do that. We'll talk about that. I can show a little bit of what I'm thinking about here with that, but that's something that'll be in the content for APP&T stuff this week. But because that would be a specific Tatana thing, whatever that may be. Those are kind of the key features of any kind of review. And if you needed something like that for remembering that you wanted to work on your beef jerky recipe or whatever, you could certainly build it that way too. And then anything that's the generic idea that doesn't necessarily fit in with anything that pre-exists, you could just have it in a kind of cycle of things that you review every so often.
Now, it doesn't detract from the value of this conversation, of course. It has its, an eternal value. But the amusing part about this particular example is that, Lori, next time you go to make beef jerky, you won't need to know, because we've talked about this enough that you'll remember this little tip.
So the real key is then obviously bring the question to a forum where we'll talk about it for about 25 minutes, and then you will never forget anything of that ever again. Good call, Kelly. That's what we'll do.
The other thing about the regular reviews, though, is that it does bring it back to your memory from time to time. So even if you're not remembering it in between, you're not having to remember completely when the time comes, because you've been bringing it up, right? That's part of that learning, that sort of reinforcing that knowledge by, having it show up every once in a while in a review. So, yes, we don't want to be carrying all that stuff around, but at that moment when you think beef jerky, oh yeah, right, I have a note about that somewhere.
Go ahead, Lori.
So another part of this, and while we've been talking, I went ahead and made a task to practice making beef jerky, and I put the Costco thing as a little note in that task. But in past iterations of systems, assigning a time or a date to a task has really tripped me up, because, and this is an example, practice making beef jerky. There's no date. And if I put a date on it, then I end up with 30 things to do on Thursday, and it's paralyzing, and none of them get done. And things just keep drifting over,
Mm-hmm.
So I don't always want a task with a date.
Oh, and I understand that. So in my own structure, and this is another thing just for you, Lori, since this is something else I'll be talking about this coming week in APP&T, I use what I call a prototask. And so a prototask functions very similarly to what I just described with the kind of a thing to remember. In my approach, this is something that is written in the book, and that I've stated, I think, fairly firmly now for about 4 months. It took me a while to come around to being willing to say it this strongly. But in my approach, if it isn't scheduled, it's not a task. If you haven't committed to a time to do it, then it's not a task. But what that requires then is a layer that we call something else that is a thing like a task, but is not scheduled. And that's what I use a prototask for. The mechanism that I use to control them is it's just that I have several queries, and I'll build these for you and show you how they're built because they're not particularly complicated, but several queries within a dashboard that allow me to see. The first query shows me the prototask created within the last 30 days. The next query shows me prototasks created within 31 to 120 days. The next one shows me 121 to 240. And then there's one last one called expiring prototasks. That is 240 to 270. And there's a lot of layers that this is helpful. One, it makes them easier to capture. If there's something I want to do possibly, but I don't know when, I can put it as a prototask and it's pretty much immediately done. I just type it, hit hashtag prototask, and it's done because the review structure will be operated by the commands that I build into the query. And I'm talking Tana here for those of you who might not use Tana, but that's these could be built. I know Brian has a method for reviewing notes that he's taken that is very similar in Obsidian. I know that because the way I built my prototasks was modeled on the way he did this in Obsidian. So it can definitely be done that way. But what that means is that task then it exists, but it's not committed to a particular day, which means it's not going to pile up on me the way tasks can if you've scheduled them. But I'm not going to lose them because I have 4 sets of recurring tasks, one for the first query, one for the second query, one for the third, one for the fourth. They all at different intervals. I think I review the first query like every 4 or 5 days, and the second query every 7 or 8, and the next one like every 8 or 9, just so that they don't overlap very much. I'm not doing them all on the same day. And then I also don't go in and review every prototask on that list that day. I'll just do 5 or 6, and I have a little button that notes that I have reviewed that one, and that it goes to the bottom of the list, which means that for each query it shows up in, the first 30 days, the following 90 days, the following 120 days, or then that final 30 days, for each one it shows up in, I'm going to see it, a few times before it moves on to the next query. So I'm not going to lose it, but I also haven't scheduled it, which means it isn't a task in my parlance. But, and we've used the word parlance a lot in this phrase, this call too. In my vocabulary, it isn't a task yet, which means I'm also not so committed to it that when I do have a day that 30 things have piled up or something like that, or if previously I would have had that, now I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm overdue on all of these things. When in reality, they're not really overdue. I can have chosen to do them at any particular time. But because I've assigned them a date, now it all feels like I'm bound to these times. Prototask takes that pressure off. I don't have to worry about it. And the other layer of prototasks for me is after 270 days, roughly 9 months, they just fall off the end because I don't have any queries that looks for any that are older than 270 days. They don't disappear from the graph. They're still there as prototasks. I just never see them. My thinking being, if I haven't chosen to do this thing in 9 months, it's time for it to just fall off the end anyway. I'm not going to do it. If I decide that I want to do it, I can cycle it back to the beginning, or that I don't want it to drop off. I can. But that's kind of the conceptual layer you're talking about there, Lori, is the task that I don't want to schedule, but I also don't want to lose the thread that it exists. That's the way prototasks work for me. And I will show you how that I have those actually implemented in Tana in that session. Yes, Penny?
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Since I capture a bunch of stuff around my task, for one thing, what bin it would go in and various other things. And we haven't seen your prototask system yet.
Right.
Why not just not set a date and do your search based on scheduled on is not set, and then make your search based on the created time.
You could certainly do that. There's nothing stopping you from it. In fact, my first search for prototasks actually also looks for if I've accidentally set it as a task but not put the date on it. So I do that at the beginning. The main reason I do it is it's a visually different thing. I need it because I'm implementing in Tana. I need a different set. I want a different set of commands for my prototasks than I have for my tasks. So it's more. You wouldn't necessarily have to implement it in the way that I did, but it gives me a little more leverage over what tasks, or excuse me, what commands will be available. And the way that I review them, it has a couple of different fields associated with it rather than tasks. That's why. But it's not, you could do it the way you're describing. It would just be a slightly different layout, what I'm doing.
Right. Okay. So it's not like it's so different in concept, except that you haven't called it a task, which for me would mean, but if it's a prototask, does it still have an assigned bin?
It does. That's the only other field it has.
So that might be the solution.
I have
to
two
that.
fields in it, and one is the bin project field, and the other one is a last reviewed field.
Right.
Yeah, and actually, if you give me a second here, I'll just go ahead and show you all what I do, because I've been talking about it too much without showing. I can't that'll make it easier to display. I'm just scanning quickly through it here, make sure there isn't anything like family related that I don't want to put on YouTube. I don't think there's anything of any major concern here. Excuse me. All right, so let me share my screen over here. As the only drawback to using Tana for all things is that if you do decide to start demoing something, you have to make sure that all of your things that are private about your family, you don't necessarily want to show, you aren't showing those. Okay, so essentially I have, as you can see, 5 queries here. Expired, recently edited, really could be removed, because it was what I used at the beginning when I was converting from my task horizons to prototasks. There were a lot, and so this was my way of catching ones that were already older than this prototask would have found, but I had just converted them to prototasks, so I could find them and decide whether I wanted to keep them or not. So I don't really need that last one, but I haven't deleted it yet. So I have in this first query. So this now we're talking about, I talked in the beginning about the bridging from a concept to implementation. The concept here is that prototask fills a conceptual gap for tasks that are not scheduled. So I haven't committed to scheduling them, but they're, I need to be able to keep the track of them. In GTD, this is essentially fulfilling a layer, giving a structure to the someday maybe concept. These are things that I might want to do someday, but this is giving them a structure that I can use here. So I have 3 things right now that were prototask created within the last 30 days. And that is, I want to redo my church desk drawer, because the desk drawer likes to, I was in choir practice, and my daughter, who was there because she had been in the children's choir practice earlier, suddenly we hear a crash, and it's because the desk drawer has literally fallen on the floor at her feet. And it's because it's a little bit wonky in there, and I might need to replace it. But I don't need to do that like immediately, and I don't have an immediate plan. And this is, I need to do it when I go to Lowe's, but also there are several other things I need to do. It's not top priority for me. I can keep it from falling when I'm using it. These, and I have these stretchy bands that we were using in a dance class for the boys that they liked. So Alicia and I, my wife and I, were thinking about buying them. This is actually on the ambassadors page for Tana. They have links to our courses and things like that. And I just want to set up myself a system to remind myself to reach out to Matt McKinley when I change something, so that he can update that page for me. And notice this is an example of a task, or in this case, a prototask, where I know that I need a little bit more structure around something, but I haven't considered exactly what that is yet. And so the task is literally set up the system, do some more thinking around it. That's a little thing that I use often enough. That's worth noting, that if I don't know exactly how to capture something yet, like if I'm not sure what this thing exactly is yet, but I know I need to address it, then this is a sort of the middle ground, the task to remind me to return to the planning for what that thing is and building what that is. And the way this query is built, for those of you who use Tana and want to look at the implementation, is that I have an or statement at the beginning. I mentioned to Penny there that I capture any unscheduled tasks here as well. This query has an or statement because of that. I capture any prototasks created within the last 30 days, last reviewed for prior to for relative date today, which I'll show you what that means here in a second. It means that if it was reviewed today, it won't appear on this, and I'll show you how that works. Or in this case, it's a task that isn't done, where the scheduled date isn't set. And so effectively, that is a prototask that I have mistagged as a task, or it's a task that I have forgotten to put a date on. Either way, having it here gives me a backstop where it's not going to just fall out of my awareness. I'll be able to find it. So that's the way that query is built. And although, if you're not a person who uses Tana, you wouldn't implement it necessarily exactly like this, but the concept, the logic of the query is probably something that could be applied in a number of different tools for thought. We're just making sure that we're catching anything that is by design here, prototask created in the last 30 days, or anything that I may have accidentally mistagged in another place and still be caught by this particular query. And then the before today stuff, I say I don't want to see anything before today. That means when I click this little button for the review, and when I say review, I just mean I've seen it. That's good. I'm not going to schedule it yet. That's fine. If I were to take this, I'm going to open this in the sidebar so you can see the what happens. So this is the prototask itself here, opened over here on the right side of my screen. So if I were to click this button, it would go from last reviewed to it'll go from Saturday, February 17th to Wednesday, February 21st, because that's today. So if I click this button, you'll see this becomes today now, and it will disappear from over here because now it no longer fits that query. In Tana, if you're on it, it lets you keep it because you might be editing it further, but you can see the little cleanup appears and it'll go away there eventually. Let me undo that. So you can see now we're back to Saturday, September 17th. The other thing I could do is I could say, hey, I'm ready to do this. Let me schedule it. That will turn it into a task. And then that task will be automatically scheduled for tomorrow. And I can update that as I see fit. But that means that when I go to plan my next agenda, it will be there because it's scheduled for the next day. So those are the two buttons that I have mixed in there. I'll close that out. Let's see all that. Oh, well. Way to go there, RJ. But I'll undo both of those things. But that's what the buttons do, is that they allow me to engage with them here. So I can either review it and it'll go away from here, or I can schedule it from here and it will then be a task that's scheduled for tomorrow. And then the next query, and I'll just show the next one because the others are the same, is just looking for prototasks that are created within the last 120 days, but not within the last 30. So effectively, I'm just eliminating the first query's results from this second query with that not statement. The rest of it's the same, except I don't do the whole looking for a task aspect because that's caught by the first query. And then the third query is the same, except this number is 240 and this number is 120. And the final query is the same too, expiring, except this number is 270 and this number is 240. So it's just one with saying, hey, look at everything in the last 120, except not the first 30. And the other ones, look at the next 240, except not the first 120. And then I have separate recurring tasks that point to each of these. So I have a recurring task every 4 or 5 days that reminds me to look at the first query. And I have a separate task that reminds me to look at the second and all of that. I put it here in the dashboard because sometimes I may want to just come here. But I also have recurring tasks that actually point me directly to the place that I need to be for those.
I think that addresses a different level of the problem, which is what you were talking about from intention to implementation. If you have a prototask that gets to 240 days, you probably should just eliminate it because you're not ever going to do it. Right. So you have a self-correction in false intention.
Right. That's very true. And I think that's one of the pieces that's really interesting about this approach, um, is that I don't have to do anything to dismiss it. It just falls away. I just won't see it anymore if it goes past that 270. So there's no that correction that you mentioned happens automatically. There's one other thing, and I would show you, except I don't have any tasks or prototasks that actually fit this criteria right now. There's nothing sitting in the expiring prototask layer. But if it's between 240 and 270, one other thing happens, and that is a command becomes available that I can click to duplicate that prototask and delete the original, which has the effect of recreating it and recycling it through the prototask. So if I get to one that's 240 to 270 and I'm like, well, I do need to do this at some point, I can always click that button. But I've only done that once. I have the button if I need it, but most of the time, as you say, if it goes past 8 months, I'm not going to do it. And so there's no reason to need to see it anymore. It takes kind of the pressure off, which I think is a nice psychological layer there. Is that lots of times, like you're talking about, Lori, when those tasks begin to pile up on days, that becomes really stressful because it's like I intended to do all this stuff and I had it all set up and now I'm behind on all of it. Well, if I don't have to have that layer telling me this is what I meant to do and I'm not doing it, but rather saying, hey, these are some things that I might do, but I don't necessarily have to. I think that psychologically speaking, that's an implementation that's less likely to cause you that suffering. I've had that experience with this too.
I think if you end up with that kind of problem routinely, where you had 150 tasks in that last group, that you probably have a disconnect between roles and projects.
I would agree.
You need to correct.
Well, and I think that you make a great point there that this is another, I hadn't even thought about this layer, but the prototasks do serve as kind of another what's the word I'm looking for? Metric is good enough. Where if suddenly there's like boatloads of tasks that are falling that are coming into that expiring thing, or prototasks rather, and it calls into question some of the things that I may be intending to do. It may not be bad, but it's certainly something worth reviewing. Like, why have I created all these things and never actually executed them? Is there something there that needs to be examined?
Because they're not tasks. For me, they're ideas. I have, 30 ideas an hour about things I can do. Right. And sometimes when I go back to them, because I have mind map sketchbooks from 5 years ago, but sometimes I can go back and I can think that was a really good idea. I never implemented that. So they're not a task. It's
and now
let me idea, and it might sometimes the idea can spark.
I agree completely.
A new thing that can be a good task.
I agree, and I'm going to layer. This is what I'm going to say. I was going to say I'm going to push back slightly, but it's not really pushback. It's just sort of a layer. When you say it's never been implemented, that's because it was never a task. And so if it's going to be done, it's got to be framed in some way that gets it to being done. Now, that said, some things are not actionable yet. There's this certain idea of sort of, we've talked about this in past cohorts. It hasn't been recent, but I remember, I don't know, around 5 or 6 or 7 in that territory of cohorts of the old applied action powered productivity. We talked about kind of how there's some layer where knowledge percolates and gradually becomes more active. And that kind of feeds back to what Brian was talking about making sure that the action may not be do the idea. The action may be the recurring action that's pointing you to look back in at those ideas so that you are reviewing them to see if there's anything of value. I think that that's the next layer of activating that knowledge if it's an idea. And I think, to be clear, prototask is intended as sort of something that's very nearly actionable. It's basically right up against it's a task, which is why I chose the word prototask. But if you pull back a layer from that, you could absolutely have something that's just idea as the super tag. And then you could have a search somewhere. This boils down to, by the way, I know I've said this a lot in some of our individual sessions, but to put it in here, I think the most important thing that you have to remember in any system, Tana makes it easy, which is one of the reasons I love Tana, but this is true of any approach, is that when you capture something, you have to make sure that that you understand how it's going to surface. Meaning, if I just jot something down, if I have no mechanism by which I'm going to see it again, there's a pretty good chance I won't. I might remember that I need to go searching for it, but I very well may not. And so even with just a simple idea tag, I now have a search because, Tana will create that automatically, or you can create it in the context you want, where you can go look at those ideas. And then if you have a recurring task that says, hey, go look at your ideas and includes a little link to where that node is or whatever that may be in your tool of choice. Now you can rest assured that those ideas are, the term I use is safe. It's safe if you know it has a way of surfacing, because then it's not going to completely disappear. So I think that this is an example where we have a tendency to think about the system level, like where do all of these things need to go? And I want to encourage everybody to think at the toolkit level. Like, okay, I need to be able to resurface this idea. I don't need to know everything about my system to know how to resurface that idea. All I need to know is if I tag something idea, where's that search going to be? And what's the recurring action that's going to point me to that search? If I can answer those questions, and those are easy questions, then I don't have to worry about it anymore. Then I can find those. And then whatever the layer may be, if it's prototask right up against action or idea that's requires a little more percolation, or maybe you find, hey, I also have ideas that are more specifically about this particular thing. I want to categorize those as being something more specific and then look at those more often or something. Whatever it is, you're still just thinking, okay, I've created this thing. Where does it need to be? And when do I need to look at it? And if you can answer those questions, you'll be fine. They will appear when you need them to appear.
RJ, this really gets back to the email exchanges, or at least what I've been sending you about
I've been
roles.
responding to many of them. You've sent a lot of emails, Brian.
But what I'm getting at is that it's easy to come up with good ideas. And if you have a whole list of good ideas, you sit there and you say to yourself, well, those are really good ideas, but I haven't done them yet. And the reason is they aren't tied correctly to the balance that you have to achieve with roles that you define. So you may have some really great ideas, RJ, about finishing your novel, but it's competing with your great ideas about writing the book that you're now writing. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't mean it's not a good idea. It just means that it doesn't cut it with respect to your role allocation. And so I think that all of this stuff has to go back to how the roles are defined and how they interact with each other, so that you can evaluate an idea not as a good idea, but as an idea that is supportive of a role that I intend actually to feed.
Right. And I think that's such an important point. And I mean, the illustration you chose is exactly right. Like, I'm not working on Time Worn right now because I'm working on the rhythms of productivity. There's only so much bandwidth I have for, writing. It's a time consuming event, and I can't just do it all the time. So there's a balance there of understanding that. And if you have that defined in your roles, and we're using it, I'll define the term here in case others haven't heard it, but a role is an identity that you embody in your work or in your life. I should put in life and work, because work is part of it. Take care, Lori. It's been a great conversation. Good to have you here. But if you have those roles defined, then you have a clearer picture of what action needs to be taken. And the word action, not surprisingly for the fellow who created action-powered productivity, the word action is the key to me, because it's easy to have a lot of ideas, but there's going to be some, there's a limited amount of time in which you'll be able to activate all of those. And if you don't have some kind of mechanism, some kind of awareness of what the balance is of what your roles, like you're saying, Brian, in what way do I take action on the things that make me an engaged family man? In what way do I take action on the things that make me a productivity thought leader and consultant? In what ways do I take action on the ideas that make me whatever that role may be? If I don't have some way of being aware of how those are in balance, I'm still going to have just an endless set of possibilities, and endless possibilities generally equate to very little action. That it needs to be narrowed down in some way so that you can choose the specific action you want to take in a particular moment. And that balance between roles. I'd be really interested, Brian, if you don't mind sharing. I know you've been sending and I've been very much reading the things that you're sending and responding to some of them. Usually I'll combine different my answers into a smaller email, but the talking about how you're doing some of the visual layer. I don't know if you have some of that you'd be able to share.
Well, I've got the example I sent you.
Okay, great.
Working with a neutral one is actually better.
Great.
So let me share the screen here.
So as Brian's sharing, I'll just say, roles, again, those are the identities that we embody in our life and in our work. And I use Tana, and I'm not great, just to be simply put, I'm not great with visual conceptualizing of things. That is not a dismissal of them. It is just an observation that it usually is not something that has much impact on me. However, it does for many people. And I think what Brian's talking about here is a really useful way to conceptualize how roles interact and balance. Now I'm going to shut up and let you talk about it, Brian.
So I was really impressed with the idea of roles and started by doing what I think RJ is doing right now, which is to create a list of roles, and under the roles to create a list of things that are appropriate to that role or required by that role. But I became uncomfortable with that because I couldn't envision how these roles balanced out, how they interact with each other. So what I'm trying to do with a mind map approach is to say that in this case, I've got 4 different roles: role A, role B, role C, role D. And if you look at role D, this is just a simple list. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the job requirements associated with D. And again, here with C, I go through, there's a C1, a C2, but a C2 has got different sub-elements that I've tried to define, and so on down here. Now, after I set that up, I realized that a second issue is the fact that you need to balance effort. So I said, okay, that means that I have to be able to at least roughly say that role C is going to get twice as much effort as role D. Right? And to use these percentages as a way to indicate where I thought the relative amount of effort, not necessarily their importance, but the relative effort involved. And then the next thing that I decided was that these roles are not independent. They play off each other. So I try to show here, for example, that this particular requirement is a prerequisite to that requirement. You have to get this one done in order to make that one work. This one, you want to coordinate it. When you do this one, you want to coordinate that effort with this one. This one, if you do this one, in other words, here you're going to write your novel. Maybe down here, that means you're not going to work out, okay, because you don't have any time. So this particular role inhibits that role. This particular role frees up the time that you need for that role. And there's all sorts of different potential interrelationships with these things. And until you come to grips with that from the standpoint of what they all are in a list form, how they interact from a balance of effort standpoint, and how they interact with each other, I think that you're working at too vague a level to be able to look at your 35 good ideas to see whether or not they're actually things that you should be implementing.
I think this is. I always just have such admiration for the the depth of thinking that you can bring across in some of the simple things that you share, Brian. So I appreciate that. The only thing I'm going to add to this is the kind of thinking that you can do when you have taken care of a lot of the quote unquote action powered things that are the day-to-day things. And let me explain what I mean by that. When I talk about action powered productivity, I say the core ideas are take action and capture recurrence. Do something, look at what you did, ask how can I do that better next time, and build the productivity bridge, the template, the automation, the procedure, the recurring task, the whatever, or combination of those will allow you to do that work more effectively in the future. And that's just one action, one bridge or, whatever to speed that up. And then you've done it. And you do that with everything. And pretty soon you have a toolkit that's functioning well for you. When you have that, once you have this more efficient way of working, then you have more bandwidth to ask yourself, okay, but am I emphasizing the right things? And that's when roles are going to start to give you more value, because you can say, well, what are the identities that I embody in my life and my work? And does this action fulfill that? And do I need to take more action in other places to be able to do that? And all of that's still action powered too, because you're looking at, sorry, I'm squeaking over here because of my laryngitis. But all of that is action powered too, because you're still looking at what are the things that I'm doing and what does that imply for the roles that I play? But then you could start to have that top down look, because as you define the roles, you can ask yourself, are these the roles I want to embody? Are these the things I want to be doing? How does it affect the choices of the action that I'm able to take? And when you've answered that question, then you can move on. And my larger point being, once you have your handle of those kind of things, you can start to look more conceptually at things like what Brian is sharing here, which is invaluable. But I wouldn't hand this chart to somebody who's starting the action-powered productivity approach, because you wouldn't know what we were talking about. But once you have captured recurrence and you have templates and automations taking care of a lot of your day-to-day, and you're doing the things that need to be done more efficiently, and you're making more sure that you're doing the right work, and you're focusing more on the work that is the right work for you. And now you can say, how do I make sure those balance? And is there a visual way that I can take a look at that to ensure that I'm doing that more effectively? So this is if there's like APP 401 advanced training, this is sort of an example of that. I think that this is illustrates that balance really effectively. I just don't want anybody to look at that and think I must know this in order to build a template to do to send an email. Those things come first, because that's what gives you the space to have a clearer understanding of the bigger picture of what you're doing. So none of that said, Brian, to in any way undermine what you're saying, but rather to reinforce that it becomes more and more valuable the more that you understand the fundamental aspects of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the vector idea. What you're talking about is speed, and what I'm talking about here is direction. So, you need both.
Yeah,
absolutely.
This is coming at a really good time for me, because I've been working on those roles and bins and projects and stuff, and just kind of getting to the point where I still have too many different roles, even though I've started, and just trying to figure out, what is a role versus what is a sub role. And sometimes it's kind of like, well, it could fit in that, but that's kind of a bigger picture. This is sort of a part of it, but not entirely. It's little, but it's like realizing I need to visualize where all these things fit, because I can't just do it in my head. I can't just make that connection and say, yes, this is where this belongs. The ability to just kind of, say, okay, C1 is part of this, but not this. Maybe it really needs to be its own separate thing. Yeah. But that visual, I think, is going to be really helpful.
Brian, we're looking at Heptabase here, correct? Is what you screenshot this from?
This is in Heptabase, although it could be in any different application that gives you a mind map. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a mind map. It could be anything. I cannot do what RJ can do, which is look at lists and intuit the relationships. That doesn't, my brain doesn't work that way.
Well, it's a blind spot for me because I can do that, and because I don't do it the other way. I forget that, in fact, I'm the weird one, that most people prefer visuals. I'm reminded daily that I'm weird, but that's one I tend to forget, that most people prefer a way of thinking about it visually, and it is a blind spot for me. No question about it. So something like this is really valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
RJ, here's a question for you.
It's also iterative. In other words, you put one of these things out, and you come back tomorrow and you change 4 or 5 things, and you come back the day after that, and change 3 or 4 more things, and you just keep building on it. There's another layer to this too that I think is interesting. If you can foresee a major change in your life, you're an expectant parent for the first time, or something, you're going to move to a new city, then you can layer, along the z-axis here, a new set of roles, okay, and realize that over the next couple of months, I've got to transition to a point where, I know how to change a diaper, or, I'm used to not sleeping at night because, you're expecting your first child. So you can look at this, in a dynamic sense. This happens to be where I am today, but I need to be able to foresee where I'm going to be a year from now.
Yes. I think
that would be interesting I think it would be really interesting to see what that actually looks like. It's like, okay, so here's where I am today. And then what that layering on would look like.
I think
as I'm heading into retirement, it's kind of like, what does my life look like at some point when I have shifted out of some of the things that I currently do, and then how do you make that transition? Would be an interesting.
One of the things I don't think Heptabase does this, but one of the things I always found limiting about mind maps whenever I try to use them is what you said, Brian, when you mentioned putting this on a z-axis. I always wanted it to be 3-dimensional. I always wanted to be able to put it on an actual z-axis and see where those things went. And that would give you another a layer of kind of doing that. I don't think that exists it doesn't exist in any mainline tool I've seen. I've seen a few that do it, but I couldn't. But that makes it even more difficult to conceptualize in many ways.
Yeah.
I love what you said about it being iterative, because this actually feeds back to something we were talking about. And I think it was you, Penny, that said this to Lori, that, as we put something in a review process and we continually review it, suddenly we're remembering it just by the virtue of having reviewed it. What you're talking about there, Brian, with iterating on this, it's very much that kind of, I go back to the Eisenhower quote, that plans are useless, but planning is everything. The iterative approach to something like this is a form of preparation. It's a form of the reminder of what it is that I'm doing. So even if you don't change much, you're constantly revisiting this. Where do I want to be? What do I need to be doing? What's the balance of those? And just through the sheer repetition of doing that, you are likely to stay more intentional about the choices you make with the actions that you're going to take, which is itself exceptionally valuable and just happens as a natural side effect, a positive side effect of regularly engaging with this.
Yeah, I mean, I was finding yesterday as I was looking around and doing some of this role stuff, is like some of these things are things that I do, I am hoping will be vestigial, but I have to get them there first. And so I was able to create a task or a project. I haven't quite figured out exactly what it is yet, but on how do I shift these particular clients into, I just called it a different realm, right? It's like a different way of dealing with them, where it isn't as active, or that they move on to, someone new. How, what's that all going to look like? And that was only coming up because of doing this, this thinking around these things.
I think Penny, one of the things that people fall into the trap is there is nothing special about having a lot of good ideas. It is really easy to have a lot of good ideas. What's special is being able to choose from among them and to operate efficiently once you make those choices. That's where the rubber meets the road. So, for example, I read the New York Times book review every Sunday morning. And it is very easy for me to say, well, here's 7 books I'm going to read this week. We go order them all. Okay. So,
Yep.
and then every 30 or 40 days, it's time to make a trip to the library and get rid of a bunch of books. So, the good ideas are a dime a dozen, and everybody's got them. So it's selection that's hard.
Well, and I'm as again, the guy who created action powered productivity, I'm going to go a step further and say execution is hard. It's
Yes.
most people just don't even a mediocre idea well executed is significantly better than a brilliant idea with which you do nothing. It's just nothing's going to happen if you don't do anything with it. And we want, I think the layer I'd add to what you said there, Brian, because I think you're dead on, is that most good ideas are, not unique to any one person. The question is who's actually going to execute it. And a lot of people don't execute good ideas because they're not perfect. And they keep trying to make ideas, they want to make the perfect idea before they get it executed. And the simple fact of the matter is that really, really great ideas don't start out as really, really great ideas. They start out as okay ideas that get executed and iterated on. There's a reason software doesn't launch at version 6.0. You have to, build it a little bit at a time. And that's the action powered approach to ideas, if you will. Execute it, get it out there, bounce it off stuff, see what happens. Because you haven't done that, it'll never grow beyond anything, beyond the basic idea. And most really good ideas that you think are really good ideas begin to seem less good as you start to try to implement them. You're like, oh, this doesn't work the way I thought it did. And then they have to be refined that way.
Yeah. It's that minimum viable product concept. And that actually came up in one of my ADHD groups today, that, just that iteration on a simple idea is what gets it to eventually becoming something more, but not starting with, the full blown, I think we've all heard of, I certainly with working in, like the world where people I know build apps and things like that, the person who spends 2 years thinking about every single thing that their app should do, and then they finally launch it to the world and nobody wants it because there's already 65 other really good to do apps and yours didn't do anything. And if you'd asked people, maybe what they needed was a different kind of app completely, so, that's.
No, I think you're right. And what you said there, in the chat, it says, although AAPP is too many A's and makes me think of AARP, is the American Association of Retired People. It makes me, as I, think about that and as I get closer to 55. But no, you're good. You're absolutely right. In fact, I've drawn that comparison in a couple places. I don't remember where exactly I mentioned it most recently, but that's exactly right. It is an iterative approach. And what it reminds me of, and I know one of Brian's favorite metaphors is the idea of evolution by natural selection. It's this idea that, which also resonates, and I can't remember, I think it was IV in a session, ton of our managers a little while by IV Ashton that many of you know from my other things. Oh, there you go. Agile action pattern. Perfect. You got it. Solved. But it is this idea of the adjacent possible. The best way to improve something is by moving into a space that is just beyond what the current thing does. In comparison to evolution by natural selection, if you have a mutation that just changes the entire makeup of a thing, well, that thing's probably going to die. That's probably not going to work. But if if it's a subtle thing and a little bit here and a little bit there, and that proves to be a little bit better fit to the environment, that's something that's likely to continue. And of course, that's a much longer term process because it's completely blind. But what we do, we have a little better sense of what is in the adjacent possible. And we can have some effect like we have when we've when we breed our vegetables. Just about everything that we eat now didn't really exist in the wild. We've turned it into something that is much more effective as food, or at least much more widely. So, whatever the end product was, we've made it easier to produce. But it's all because we're directing that along what's next. And I think a lot of times what people think creativity or new products or something is this sort of grand leap into some entirely new conceptual space. Well, that generally doesn't work. It can sometimes. It can be revolutionary, but usually even revolutionary things are just toggling the switches of things that already exist. And so, I can look at how did Kelly execute some particular project when he did it, and I can say, well, I'm going to write that down in a note and then base my own action off of that. And maybe I won't take all of his tasks straight up. Maybe I'll note them and then act on them as I go. But because I have borrowed that from something that works and just tweaked it toward what I need, I have a greater likelihood that thing is going to be effective. And when we try to build the whole thing from first principles or whatever, it's unlikely that we're going to build something that actually functions. But when we do it based on, as Penny say, what do people actually need? What do people actually want? What has actually worked? What is just beyond what has been done? What is a flip of the switch from what has been done? Toggle one thing and now it's the same but different in one important way. When we do things that way, when we add bridges to our workflow that way, when we build our toolkit based on the action we've already taken, then we have something that is likely to be stable and improving over time. And when we do that to all of our workflows, we have something, it becomes, I use the term, probably abuse the term exponential when I say that. I say linear is improving one workflow and exponential is having all of these other workflows that improve, and all of them together improving gives you more bandwidth to improve other things. Probably there's a top limit to that. So exponential is not quite the mathematical word, but it's still an enormous increase that can happen. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Penny, but just hearing the way you've talked about your approach over the last 6 months or so since I've been with you, I've heard you talk more about, okay, now because I can see this, then this part gets easier. And now because I have these containers, then that part gets easier. And now because each time it feels like there's been that kind of this thing working opens up the possibility of the other thing working, opens up the possibility of the other thing working, and all those things combined,
Absolutely. I've spent years trying to figure out, okay, when I finally get to the point of not wanting to be a web developer and host people's websites anymore, how am I going to do this? But I'd never had a place to really organize my thoughts around that. And I'd keep making little on pieces of paper saying, okay, think about this. And it was never happening. But now I've got with the system that at least keeps reminding me that. So today I happened to be on my server and was like, oh yeah, right. I'm thinking about this. Here's, let me just assess a little bit here as to what's going to be involved. It spent 5 minutes and I've got at least, it's like, okay, it's not going to be as big a thing as I thought,
Right.
Yep. So
I love it.
Yeah, it helps a lot.
So another evolution thing that you should consider, RJ, is the people that sign up for your course are engaged in horizontal gene transfer.
Okay.
They're taking, strings of DNA that you've developed and sticking it into themselves.
That's exactly right. That's right. Well, and I think that's a great analogy for what I want the building blocks to be when I talk about those productivity bridges. They aren't the things you need to do. They're the DNA with which you can build the things that you need to do, which I think is really nice. Did you start to say something, Penny?
No.
Okay, I thought I heard somebody start talking and then I interrupted, but no. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left in the 90 minutes. Anybody else have any considerations they'd like to bring up or things they'd like to address?
I wanted to just share a thought that came up for me because I found it really useful. When I'm trying to clean up my mess and figure out where to put things, something from that, I can't remember where I read it. It was in one of your materials, came to mind, and I found it really useful. And that's just when do I want to see this again? Under what circumstances, under which conditions do I want to see this again? And I find that just continually asking myself this question has been a real help in sort of guiding me as to how I want to structure things, where I want to put things, where I want to put any particular note. And I know we sort of touched on a similar idea at the beginning of the meeting, but unfortunately I had to hop off. But anyway, yeah.
Oh no, I think that's I love that reinforcement, because if there's any one component of APP that can bring the fastest, quickest value, it's that one. Just simply asking, as I write something down, in what context do I want to see this again, will solve a lot of problems quickly, because not only will you see that thing again when you want to see it, but if you ask that of the next thing, and you ask that of the next thing, you ask that of the next thing, pretty soon you're going to see the patterns that all these are all types of notes that if I capture them a certain way, I can see them a certain way. These are all types of tasks that if I capture them a certain way, I'll see them a certain way. So the patterns can emerge just from asking that one question and taking the action required to answer that question. And it really only comes from, I think I have it around, yeah, I have it right here on my table. How to take smart notes. One of the biggest things that Sonka Aaron says in there is, what is the, in what context do I want to see this note again? And that's how you decide where you're going to put it in your Zettelkasten. I don't use this approach really to Zettelkastening, but the question is a great one. It's not so much, what is it? What category do I put it in? Because there could be a ton of answers to that. The question is, in what context will it be valuable to me again? And if you answer that, then you'll have a lot more success with that. And I love, by the way, Brian, how Zoom thought you were doing a thumbs up just because you had a thumb up on your arm.
It's not Zoom.
Exactly.
That's Mac OS.
Oh, that's Mac OS doing it on Zoom. That's right.
Yeah.
There you go. So if I give a thumbs up, it'll decide, yep, there, it gives me the thumbs up. You just had your arm crossed and it looked kind of like a thumbs up, and it did a thumbs up.
There we go.
Oh, wow. That one's exciting. I didn't know that existed.
Hey, before we drop off, I just wanted to mention that I think that what you're doing on Twitter as far as posting your log is very informative.
Well, good.
And in particular, I like the idea that you are looking at a log and analyzing it from the standpoint of, how could I have made this more efficient?
Right.
And if you say, of the 23 things that are on here, 18 of them were done as efficiently as I could have done them. And of the 5 that weren't, I have come up with ways that 3 of them will be more efficient the next time around. Right. I think that that's a really good way to take a look and see whether you're making progress.
Good. Well, I appreciate that. And it seems to be doing reasonably well. I know from the past not to put too much stock in how many people comment or like something, because a lot of people see but don't, but actually have been having for me at least, a reasonable amount of engagement with those. So I'm pleased with it's nice because it's a forcing function to make me look and talk about the things that I'm doing, but it then has the additional effect of being something that I can share, which is nice. Cool. All right, folks, I'm going to give my voice a break now. Thank you all. I think this was a really exciting session. It really is reminiscent of what we did in the cohorts. And it's the reason I wanted to do it, is I felt that the community needed a space that we could have these kind of conversations that would be then available to anybody in Pro. And then I think I'll probably use this for YouTube, unless I look back at it and I'm like, boy, I looked weird, but I can see myself right now and I look okay. So as much as one can expect. With this. But yeah, great, everybody. It was good to see you all, and take care. Well, we'll do this again here soon.